You're listening to Progress Canada, presented by Lightbulb Narrative. Today we're joined by Iain Rankin, the 29th Premier of Nova Scotia and current House Leader of the Nova Scotia Liberal Party. Thanks for joining me.
Oh, it's a pleasure to join you. Thanks for having me.
Okay, so I want to go back to, the beginning of your career because it's always nice to find out about people's origin stories in politics. So you ran for the first time over a decade ago, and this was a pretty seismic change in the politics in Nova Scotia at the time. There was a Liberal majority that came into office. You actually won your own riding with 52% of the vote, which is an enormous number that not a lot of politicians get locally. So that's quite an achievement in itself. Can you tell our listeners why you decided to run in the first place? You were pretty young at the time. You're still pretty young now. And what it was like to help bring in that change to Nova Scotia.
Yeah, that is really the quintessential question politicians get asked, and it's an important one. I really just wanted to, at the outset, help my community, and I grew up in the Timberley area, so privileged to represent them for the last 12 years. But I really wanted to help build projects around the community. The schools were getting run down. Our community center didn't even have a gymnasium, and so I really was passionate about helping kids have access to recreation assets. And I thought that the timing was right. Politics is about timing often, and we had a long-standing member of the NDP not reoffer, and so I was in the business community at the time, having recently moved back actually from Ottawa. So I was back home for about a year, just developing my own business with some partners, and this opportunity came up, and I said, I've been a Liberal for a while. I grew up around politics, and my father was a municipal politician for 25 years too, so I had exposure to what it means to serve the public, and I really valued it, and decided to go for it. And the timing was right, as you said. The Liberals came into government during that election, so I was able to sit on the government side right away.
So you mentioned your father. Had you been really involved in his campaigns at all? Were you, I went to university in Ottawa, so I know what that environment is like. Did that spark an interest in you? What really started it for you?
Yeah, and it was exciting as a kid growing up. I was about 8 years old when my father first ran in '91. And I was limitedly involved and helping put up signs and stuff at a young age, and eventually knocking on doors. And there were 7 elections that he went through, all of them successful. So that was definitely part of it. But it was also, when I was in Ottawa, I did participate in the local riding association for the provincial Liberals. I always like provincial politics and the issues that they cover. And so I was on Phil McNeely's riding association in the east end of Ottawa while I was working in the private sector. So I had that connection to the party, and the family connections go back quite a ways. Families from Cape Breton, it goes all the way back to Alan Jay's time, and his connection with my family. My grandfather definitely was an influence in terms of values and valuing social policy, and really being excited about what's possible with the vehicle of politics. Because for me, it's not the end. It's a way that we can help shape public policy that's going to help people in the long run.
I'm interested in the fact that you helped out Phil, because he's from my days of working in government as well, at the start of my days in working in government. But do you find there's a lot of difference between Ontario and Nova Scotia provincial politics? Like sometimes you go across this country and, maybe an NDP is a Liberal somewhere else in those kinds of discussions. But I feel like there are some similarities between Ontario and the Atlantic provinces politically.
Yeah, I think so. And it does come down to the leader a lot. But I think if you look at what Ontario was working on during the time that I was up there, and Phil was very, a strong advocate for the environment, and Premier McGuinty, of course. So the coal phase out was something that was very interesting, and not without its challenges. And when I was running for leader, it was one of the main planks that I was trying to advocate for, in terms of an economic imperative as well as the right thing to do for the environment. So yeah, I think we're a center party in Atlantic. Generally, we're a center party in Ontario, and there's always going to be differences. And I think we've seen recent differences in the policy and sometimes the approach to the policy as well when you look at the federal team and the provincial teams across the country, because sometimes when you're trying to do the right thing, it may not be overwhelmingly popular, and there's all kinds of inputs. And so you have to try to look at the regional impact. And I think that generally Liberals are at their best when they're trying to be a practical progressive party, and I think you see that in both provinces.
That's actually a really good pivot point for me on 2 points here, because I want to talk about your time as Minister of Environment. So, a few years into this mandate, you got appointed to cabinet, and your first role was Minister of Environment. And I think you did a lot of really, really important things there. Now, I'm a little biased. I used to work for, he was Minister of Housing at the time, but Ontario's Minister of Environment and Climate Change around this time as well, Chris Ballard. And you worked on something that he also got to work on, which is the cap and trade system and putting a price on carbon. And you're just talking about difficult decisions that people don't always like. And those kinds of conversations often circle around our environmental policies as a country and as provinces. Can you talk a little bit about bringing in that legislation and why you made that choice for a cap and trade system as opposed to, say, a carbon tax or something like that? Because you were just talking about the economic benefits of pursuing environmental progress.
Yeah, and I actually got to know Chris just a little bit on that file because we were both participating at the FPTs, of course, but also we're both at one of the COP events in Germany, and we talked about possible linking opportunities, which would have been a potential next step for a small market like Nova Scotia. We had some liquidity challenges in our market, but at the end of the day, when we looked at the policy options in the Pan-Canadian framework, this was the way that we could keep the cost low. And you see what happens when a price on carbon can get so high that you start to lose people from a public policy perspective. And this was the way that we thought we could look at an incremental approach. And so the start of the program was 1 cent a liter, effectively, and very modest impact on power bills. So, but that revenue that came in was significant, tens of millions of dollars that we were able to put into programs, into a green fund, where we helped low income Nova Scotians lower their power bills through efficiency programs and incentives to electrify transportation, and good programs that youth were involved in to protect our environment. So, and that fund's now gone because the program's not there, and so you're seeing these programs one by one be removed. So basically, it was an option that fit our context in Nova Scotia, where we already made tremendous progress on reducing our emissions. We were one of the leaders in the country, and we actually were able to negotiate a carbon price that was lower based on including that work that was underway to lower. So our cap effectively was higher, making the price on carbon lower at the outset. And it was always designed to start to raise up when people were able to change to better methods of transportation and things like that. So it was good for the economy. Cap and trade in general, I think, is personally, it's a good policy choice because it incentivizes the lowest cost reduction in the market. And the bigger the market is, the better opportunity there is. And so we were always going to look at a long-term solution, whether that was joining Ontario, Quebec, and California at the time, recognizing there's pros and cons to all of that. But I think in an ideal world, we'd have at least a Canada, if not a North American market that had the most cost-effective carbon reduction plan.
Well, and I think that was, part of the appeal at the time. You had California, this enormous economy, Quebec and Ontario too, very big, all participating in this together. Did you have a lot of blowback provincially on that policy, or was this something that happened a little later when, the federal carbon tax came in?
Yeah, I think it originally people didn't know what to think, other than strong policy people. I do remember passing it in the legislature where the NDP thought that we weren't tough enough on large industry because we were giving allowances out, and that really was to protect the cost for consumers because we passed on. But then the Conservatives just weren't interested in any kind of action on putting a price on pollution, so they labeled it a carbon tax. So both of those opposition parties voted against it, and we tried to make these arguments once we were in opposition, and it was more politically advantageous for Premier Houston and their group to fight a fight they knew they couldn't win, and so the backstop was applied. Our system was removed, and then you saw a jump from just a cent or two to 15, 16 cents. And obviously, people weren't going to be happy with that kind of a big increase all at once.
Do you think there's a world where, a future Nova Scotia Liberal leader can bring something like that back in, or is the ship sort of sailed on that policy now?
Well, the context of today is a difficult one to operate in when you talk about anything to do with affordability and environment and where they clash. I think that, frankly, it's the conversation will come back. I mean, it's interesting to me that climate change has taken a back seat at the same time that the impacts of climate change are becoming more pronounced all around us. So I think it's even more important to talk about policy solutions, and whether or not that's the right one to fit the time will be an interesting debate. We still have a form of basically a cap and trade in our performance standards with an industry. And there probably always will be at this point moving forward some kind of need to either use the stick or the carrot in terms of policy formation. I think most parties provincially see that. Federally is a bit of a different context with our industry makeup in Alberta, but I think that there's always going to be a need to have the conversation on how do we lower emissions and actually help the economy at the same time, which has always been my focus.
So speaking of the stick, when you were Minister of Environment, you also hired a Crown prosecutor to basically enforce the Environment Act. So, anyone who's been to Nova Scotia understands what a beautiful place it is. Cape Breton, people talk about it all the time. I've gone there many times. Actually, my godparents live in Nova Scotia. They're in Antigonish. So
Nice.
It's just a beautiful, beautiful place, very much worth protecting. And I think across the country, Canadians appreciate the natural beauty of this country, but I think it is really pronounced in Atlantic Canada specifically. Why was this so important to actually, move prosecution outside of, say, a ministerial office and put the actual crown behind that to protect the environment in the province?
Yeah, that was my idea that I brought to the premier at the time, and he thought it was a good one. So because we needed to have some kind of level of competency with our prosecutor, and we have done that before on looking at specialized prosecution for sexual violence, intimate partner violence, that kind of thing. So this is a way that we could actually ensure that we could hold polluters or those that have broken, exceeded standards that were put in place, and give some teeth to the legislation that's before the province. And I think that this was a way that we were successful, because you looked at other companies that have almost made a mockery of the fines being slapped with a summary offense ticket in the hundreds of dollars, and just looking at it as a cost of business. And the way to really try to hold them account is potentially having the stick of like long form prosecution. So for a long time, Nova Scotia, you're right, it's a beautiful place, but because we are small, I think over time our economy has have been reliant on individual companies, and governments can look the other way, even though that there's pollution that has to be looked after. So the dedicated prosecutor, I think, was a good one, and it's still in place. So I'm glad to see the government keep it.
So something else you did, which I think is, a conversation that we've been having across the country, and it was the policy of going after abandoned mines and making sure they get cleaned up. What was the impetus for that? Why did you decide that was a big priority for you at the time as minister?
Yeah, again, I think and this is generations ago, where gold mines came in, and the practices for mining have changed significantly, but we had this historic liability on our books. So financially, that's an impact to the province, but communities live around these places. We're a small geographic place, and we need to make sure that we're doing our part. A lot of it's on Crown land, so there's a responsibility there. And when we had some fiscal capacity, departments can put forward ideas on how how that we can utilize that funding. And so yeah, there's arsenic and lead and all kinds of things that, if you can try to find a way to systematically look at them, evidence based and prioritize. That was the process we put around, and there's lots of them around. So that was the process that started, and there still is a lot of work to do, but there is some progress that continues to happen.
How important do you think those conversations are to have now? Like, I'm looking at the federal scene where we're talking about all these nation building projects. A lot of them in Ontario specifically are about mining, of course. What did you learn through that process that maybe we could learn now as we push forward as a country?
I think, this is where politics sometimes becomes a little too polarized. It's either you're for or against development, and right now, I think the temperature is about fast tracking approvals, and that's fine. There is efficiencies that can be found, and there is duplication, and sometimes different departments are waiting on other departments to give the go ahead, and so we can streamline as long as we don't lose focus that one of government's primary roles is to protect the public interest, and that includes environmental degradation. And so we just need to make sure companies are following existing rules, that those rules are modernized, and that all the practices that protect the environment are in place. And I think that conversation can happen simultaneously. And when it gets into the political realm, I think sometimes we lose focus. Is that if you're not going to let us speed through all of this, then you're against the sector, and that's not helpful. I think that we as a country recognize we need to be more self-reliant on energy, on materials we use. Everything we use is related to mine, our cell phones, everything. So we need it, but there is a way, I think, that we can have a responsible debate around streamlining and modernizing and ensuring that whatever the company does, whatever's left behind, is that there's a security put up to ensure that liability is taken care of, so that taxpayers, and this is a fiscal consideration, that taxpayers don't have to clean that up.
So I want to talk now about your run for leader because you were the youngest of the three candidates at the time. Um, you're barely older than me, which makes me have certain feelings, I think, about the political process. It's kind of like when you're watching Olympians and you're like, oh, I'm ancient compared to that person. It's starting to feel like that for me in politics. But you were the youngest of the three candidates, and your campaign was really focused on generational change, economic recovery from the pandemic, of course, and then environmental action, which I think, to me, are the three pieces that a lot of progressive parties should be pursuing right now. You ended up winning that race. Why do you think your campaign frame was so successful and why it connected with Nova Scotians?
Well, I think they were ready for some kind of change. We were in two-term government, and I really tried to push the agenda on the environment. That's no secret, and getting the debate in the House around the climate emergency. But I think that it was time for someone that brought a bit of a different perspective in the future. And I what I did was aligned our fiscal responsibility that we were known for with environmental responsibility. Like, let's not leave the next generation to have to face what we're leaving behind for them. So we really tapped into the youth, and ensuring that if we were going to grow the economy, that we can do it in a way that benefits people that were not historically included in the conversation around partnerships with Indigenous peoples, with the legacy of treatment of African Nova Scotians. And so that was important to me, and I think that was the way that I was able to unleash, so to speak, and speak more directly about our challenges. But it all came back to the economy for me, because we were in the pandemic. We were talking about everything around COVID-19, but what was next? And I was trying to position Nova Scotia as taking the opportunity in their leadership role that Steve McNeil led, as one of the safest, if not the safest places to be in Canada during that, to capitalize on the opportunity and build back better than we ever have, and more inclusive. And so that resonated with young Nova Scotians that were concerned about, our high poverty rates, our reliance on fossil fuels for energy, and just the systemic issues around all the issues around systemic racism. So I tried to package those in and create a vision that would inspire liberals, and I think that because I was the most differentiating candidate, and perhaps it was my age that helped, but I really thought it was time that we shifted a bit of the conversation around that and worked out for the leadership. But and then things didn't go so well for me once I went to the general election.
Before we get there, I do want to talk about this shift because it's something I think about a lot. You know, I've worked in government as a staffer, I've been on a lot of political campaigns, and I think there are moments where society sort of shifts towards the next era of politics and policy and, social growth and all those things. And some of the things that you were just talking about, I think we're having a battle right now in this country where young people, we're always told like, oh, you can't, spend money on that as a government because young people will pay for that debt down the road. But we never talk about social debt. We never talk about environmental debt, all these things we are not investing in or addressing for young people because we keep saying, oh, it's too much of a cost for them. Well, we are going to pay in different ways going forward, of course. I think your campaign for leader really addressed that and the fact that we actually need a new political frame for the next 20 years. How much of that thinking informed how you shaped your campaign? Because I feel like even when you were a minister, you were very much looking towards the future in a way that not all politicians do.
Yeah, I was trying to be the bridge in between. Obviously, you're trying to appeal to a broad group, and the base probably was on the younger side, and progressive side. But I think it was about trying to ensure that everyone realizes that we all benefit. And I think people, especially if I could say young men, are really grappling with that they believe that they're losing something if somebody else gains. And for me, we can create policy that's forward looking, that helps the most vulnerable and help society as a whole at the same time. And anytime there's tough times in the context that you're talking about today, people are looking for places to blame. So that's what I feel like in terms of the equity question is it's unfortunate that people have a right to be angry. Young people have a right to be angry that they can't afford a house like they could in previous generations, but they need to be careful of who's at fault for that policy that where we are today, and it's not the people that have been marginalized for generations. So we need to think about the full cost accounting, to your point, on when we don't properly provide for people and we don't allow people to participate in the economy, and there's barriers that has a real impact on all of us and our ability to be the best we can be. And so I think we need to figure out how to have debate in the country and not have the center hollowed out, because right now it's federally, certainly it's very polarized, and we're seeing it even though some people think parties are closer provincially. The polarization and what's happening with debate is not healthy at all. And I think it's up to people like us to try to frame it back into how we can collectively come together, work together to the extent that we can, and come up with policy that'll help and not really, use the style that we're seeing used to say that people aren't included in the process.
Something that I think is interesting is, so as a fellow millennial, you probably, I think we're 3 years apart actually. So we're pretty close in age. And there was a sense I got growing up and, like in my late teens, early 20s of, you mentioned young men. Young men were sold this certain vision of the future that if they just worked hard, treated people well, whatever, they would essentially inherit the same sort of lifestyle as their fathers, and they'd be able to get a house, they'd be able to provide for the family, yada yada. And I think young women were promised a scenario where we would suddenly have this like proper level of equality and we'd be able to do whatever we want. And I think for millennials specifically, the narratives we were sold about the future in our lives and the idea that every generation, is better off than the last just never really materialized. And that's even more pronounced for Gen Z, and Gen Alpha is coming right behind them. And I wonder, you're on the hustings all the time. You talk to people all the time. Are you seeing generational differences in how people are feeling about politics and how they're responding to, the policy solutions that are out there? What does that look like in Nova Scotia right now, generationally?
Yeah, I think that, well, social media is obviously a driver around this. I can't not mention that. And I did put a bill forward that would restrict use of social media
Right,
for,
right.
and that is about mental health and appropriateness of what people are seeing and all that. But I think like in media here, not many people rely on print media anymore, and they're getting all their news from social media. And so that's driving the polarization. The algorithms are saying, showing people what they want to see, and it validates them. If you're angry about something and you believe that that immigration is a bad thing, then that policy, which could be a constructive policy around what are the appropriate levels, where should we be targeting it, ends up being this polarized, um, sometimes inappropriate and xenophobic conversation that just starts to go onto young people's feed every day. So I think it is changing politics, and I think that I don't know if it's getting worse by demographic. I don't know all those the alpha generation. It's probably going to be harder for me to relate to going down that far, but it does worry me, and I think that. But I am optimistic. I think that there's ways that people can get involved and find ways to create policy to tap into all demographics and try to make things better.
So speaking of, I want to talk about your time as premier because you were premier for just a number of months, but you actually had a really, really busy time. Like you put forward so many really great policies that I think sometimes people can look at your time in office as very truncated, but you still were very, very active and contributed a lot to advancing the province. So, there's a number of different policies on race. You introduced the Emancipation Day Act, created the African Nova Scotian Justice Institute. Andrea Anderson, she was Nova Scotia's first racialized public services commissioner. So you did a bunch of stuff on that. You did a bunch of stuff on reconciliation. When it comes to kids, again, you were just mentioning mental health. You created the Office of Mental Health and Addictions. You were the one that actually signed the $10 a day childcare legislation, and we will get back to that later. But you also continued everything that you were doing on the environment. So, incentives for purchasing EVs, commitment to end coal burning 10 years earlier, 60 new wilderness. Like this is a very long list for somebody who was only premier for a couple of months, right? A few
Yeah,
months. So
busy time.
given all of that, one, how did you, embark on so many things in that small amount of time? And what do you think was perhaps your legacy there? What did you find the most important of all those things that you worked on?
Well, I think it's hard to choose one, but if I hope that I made an impact on shifting the trajectory in Nova Scotia, and I think that evidence that I have had some impact is that some of that structural change is still in existence today. Some of it has been not as prioritized as much. The Office of Equity and Anti-Racism still exists, but they're not living up to the potential and the vision that they could be in terms of being a nucleus of government. But we added climate change to the Department of Environment. Before it was just a regulatory office, and now we have a full division on climate change that they have a plan. We can criticize the plan, but at least that structure is there. And that was probably the most rewarding part of that job was the weeks after winning the leadership and getting in the room with great minds and finding ways to reorganize new offices and name changes and shaking up the public service and those decisions I think really did shift the way that government operates. But it always comes back to the economy for me and how we create a fairer economy that's more sustainable. And the tender that I put out for the largest renewable energy went through the process, and the government is not only doing that, but they're looking at other renewable energy projects like offshore wind, which was always on the horizon. But I think that shift, I think, helped our economy. I think it helped how government, the relationship with African Nova Scotians and Mi'kmaq. But it is hard to just choose one of those initiatives. But I'm certainly proud of the work that we did, and we did it because we had a great team, staff, and my colleagues too.
Well, and the other thing I will say about that time is that when you win a leadership, it's not like you're operating in a vacuum. You get to be premier and then unfold things on the timeline you wish. You were still in the middle of the pandemic period where we were rolling out vaccines and things like that. And, there was a lot of economic fallout from that period as well. People were struggling. Like you were not operating in a vacuum of, okay, and here are now the policies I would like to roll out as premier. You had all that going on, and you had also an election on the way as well. So there are lots of distractions, a lot of things pulling focus. So I imagine it's a very difficult time to get a lot done. And so, kudos to you and your team for still advancing all those priorities, because it is not easy when people don't often see behind the curtain, but there are so many moving pieces to get any piece of legislation or policy forward. So I do think it's very impressive. I do want to talk about the election though. So you entered that campaign, the government had a 75% approval rating, which I think speaks to the policies that we were putting forward and the new energy that you brought. Despite that fact, on election day, Tim Houston ended up getting a 3-seat majority. And this is one of these things where, what you see in the polls, I think you did lead in the polls every day of the campaign, and polls aren't always right. Sometimes, vote splits at local levels, they break one way or another that you don't expect. And politics is hard at the end of the day. I will say, though, the McNeil majority in 2017 was a 1-seat majority. So there was, the traditional thing that happens to a government. You mentioned this earlier. It was a 2-term government already in place. Asking for a 3rd term from the populace is always a really difficult act of persuasion, because it's not something that usually follows through. Voters in Canada, especially, usually around the 8 to 10-year mark, sort of say, we want to try something different, even if they don't dislike what is already there in the premier's office. So can you talk about that campaign and what you think happened, and what perhaps your party can learn from that election loss going forward?
Yeah, and that's a really important question, especially as we're in our position now that we have to rebuild. I think there were a number of things working in my favor and against me. I think that something that really wasn't reported, I don't think at all, is I was in a minority government by the time I was going to the polls. Steve McNeil did resign his seat, and he had a long career, and then there was another member that resigned. So we were operating with less incumbents going into that election than the opposition, the team that won. So recruiting candidates in a quick order to be ready and not having that time to be at the doors, I think was definitely an impact. But I could have done a better job on messaging what was in our platform. I'm very proud of the policy, and I think that's probably my strongest suit is policy. And we had a comprehensive platform against a team that had a flashy magazine with policy that mostly wasn't ever even considered still 4 years later. So we had the better policy, but we really didn't have strong messaging to connect that policy to everyday concerns that people had. And I think that that's on me. We need to have a clear message in a campaign that makes sure that it's not too complex, that's easily digestible for people to understand. How does this benefit me? And so that was tough, and being someone that takes over a government and trying to stick handle the criticism, and in trying to, making sure that you're not too defensive on stuff, but not trying to separate yourself entirely. I was in cabinet on that team for the last 4 years of it anyway, and I think that's where I probably seemed a little guarded and not able to just be freely speaking about the things that I was passionate about and creating the messaging in behind it. And that was against a team that basically said we're going to fix healthcare over and over and over again. Strong, easily understood message, and it worked for them. It was 1.7% of the popular vote we lost by, but we lost a lot of the seats in rural communities where Nova Scotians were concerned about healthcare for quite a few years before the pandemic. And the previous 5 or 6 by-elections, we lost all of them. So there was definitely a whole bunch of things happening. And I think what I've learned, though, it's people like to point to one issue, why a loss happens. And I think there's always a bunch of different issues, some of them more pronounced than others, of course. Issues management during the campaign we could have dealt better with. But I think that, it's overall, there were lessons learned. Proud of the record, proud of our positive brand, and not stooping to the low gutter politics. That'll always be my belief. But sometimes it doesn't go your way and you just move forward.
How much of it do you think is timing? Because obviously we just talked about the long term of the government, but I kind of imagine that, some of the frame that you had would fit much better for this moment than say that moment. How much of politics comes to just luck and timing, do you think?
Yeah, timing is everything. I think it didn't help that I had to shut down the province, and so there were people that were angry, and some of them owned businesses, and we were very small businesses supported our government for a lot of the good work we did in reducing their taxes and regulatory burdens. So that was a tough thing to do, but you know what? I don't regret any of those decisions during COVID. Protecting the most vulnerable, the senior population, and knowing that you could literally save lives was so important to me more than that's why I was able to sleep at night. But the issues were tough, and the timing around the election that could be studied and studied. Some people were very strong that I should have waited longer, but my previous point, I'd have to go back in the House with the minority government in a polarized environment, which would be difficult. Or the other option is sooner, right after the leadership, which was kind of like what Mark Carney did, and so that benefited. That seemed to work for them, but it's really hard. I mean, you see Newfoundland, what happened there, and that's a good parallel, I think, to our situation, having the tenure of a few months, put your own stamp on it, try to show people that your government is a little bit different, but still take the positives of the previous work. And that's why it's been so challenging, I think, in history.
Yeah, and I think, there's not really a right answer to those questions. There's a lot of Monday morning quarterbacking on that because, of course, with hindsight, everybody's an expert on what should have happened. But, you mentioned the Mark Carney example. There's also the David Peterson example where, that did not go to plan. There's the Kathleen Wynne example where she waited, a year and a bit and ended up winning a majority, but then historic loss after that, similar to where you guys are now. So, I mean, I don't think there's any great answer to it. And the will of the voters is ultimately what decides these things at the end of the day. I
Mhm.
want to talk now a bit about, present day Nova Scotia, because I think that's pretty important. We're now in, a second majority of the Houston years, and they're definitely reshaping Nova Scotia. The question is it for the better? And, I have my opinions on that. I'm sure you do as well. You've introduced, I counted 26 bills in 2025, which is an incredible number, especially given how little you've actually been sitting. And I want to talk to you about that. What are some of the bills that you put forward that you're really passionate about? And how do you think they can help get this government back on track, on behalf of Nova Scotians?
Yeah, and part of that is we are admittedly a caucus of two, so the bills aren't spread out as much amongst the team, but they are, I think, important ideas that are put forward. I think that the government has certainly changed the style, I could say, and I think that's well known that they tried to fire the auditor general. They changed the rules of the House to try to get in and out really quick. They avoid media, and they literally say that in their fundraising emails. And so what we're trying to do is bring back a little bit more of respect for democracy. We're also looking at how we get back to the transition away from coal, and we put forward lots of ideas on how to do that, but also protect power bills, help those most vulnerable. We've fought against the end of the solar rebate program, and areas around childcare. We've advocated to make sure that's sped up to get to the goal that was committed to in March of 2026. And the economy has been a focus for us. It's a focus, I think, for all Nova Scotians and Canadians at this juncture. So we try to make sure that we're a progressive contributor to the debate in the House. I think in opposition, we're respected that we don't automatically oppose everything, and we're constructive in how we bring ideas forward. So that's been working really well, and I think that there's good ideas that should be adopted, and they can take them and put their own stamp on it, and actually they have. So that's the interesting thing about opposition is sometimes you do get a lot done. I've noticed that we have, but you don't get the credit, and that's fine because that's not what we're in it for. But we've been able to push for things like RSV vaccines to be free for babies, and the lunch program. We fought for it, the NDP fought for it, and then the Conservatives eventually adopted it. There's a lot of different policy that came originally from opposition, and even at committees were pushing for a roundtable to address the issue of gender-based violence, and that they eventually did it the day before the committee was going to vote on my motion. So again, you have to adjust, and I think we're really Derek Mumbercat and our experience on the government side as ministers has really helped us understand what the tools that we have are to help shape that positive change.
I wanted to ask about that actually, because you are the third party right now, but there's almost an element of given all your experience in government, there's almost an element of you being, I don't want to say like the true opposition or whatever, the people's opposition as the Ontario Liberals are calling themselves. But with that experience, the NDP is much further in the rear view in terms of government experience than you are. And I think you're right that does lend itself to some really substantial proposals being put forward, and that they are then able to be adopted more readily by the government. Do you feel like that is the case?
Yeah, I think so. I think what we're trying to show is that we have the experience. We're willing to support the government at times, and we've talked in support of the offshore wind potential that the province has. Like sometimes we think that the government is scrambling to find the next big mega project, and they shift around from hydrogen, and now it's this, to distract from some of the other issues and their $1 billion deficit and things like that. And the NDP, they have put forward some good ideas. I think their support base is very much has been restricted to the Halifax area, and not as much in the rural communities. And I think if we can compare, we're putting forward policy that would help traditional sectors in rural communities that have been adopted. Like we really push for the wood heat, small wood heat energy projects that would help industry, but also help reduce oil in some of these old buildings. And it took four years for the government to adopt it finally. But those are the kind of policies that I think that we're putting forward that resonate more broadly than say what the NDP is focused on right now.
So before we wrap up, I want to talk about the leadership race. So the leadership race for your party is not going to wrap up until November 28th of 2026. So a full year from now, which, we have these debates all the time of like, what should the timeline be? And, with a majority, you have a bit more time to do these things, perhaps not in Ontario based on recent news, but usually that gives you a nice runway to, one, encourage a lot of great candidates to run, two, to really vet their ideas, and three, come together as a party around hopefully one candidate, maybe not on a single ballot, but throughout the balloting process. You've said you're not running for the job, which I find disappointing, but I fully understand. You have a new child and you've done it before, and all those things.
We actually have 3 young children now under the age of 4, so I don't think that's even an option.
I think that's entirely fair as one of 4 myself. But given all your experience, I suspect you have a lot to offer, potential candidates who want to run in terms of advice, telegraphing what some of the issues are that should be focused on, because, again, you have your ear to the ground and are very familiar with the things that Nova Scotians are struggling with right now. What advice would you give to fellow candidates, and what kind of issues do you hope the leadership race focuses on?
Well, I think my main advice for a leader or anyone getting into politics is to be true to yourself and people can see through. I think when you're trying to do things and say things that people want to hear, but I think you'll never regret if you go into something, you're passionate about something, and you stand on it. So for this leadership race, hopefully it spurs a lot of ideas and pretty good debate around the issues that are important to Nova Scotians right now. I think that talking about what happened in previous elections is not the right way to go. I don't think that we need to relitigate the past and decisions that voters made. Like, voters are always right, whether we like it or not. They get the government they deserve. And we can look at what's happening now with the current government and what they're doing. And I think that there's a lot of material there, and a government that is closed doors, that is getting used to hiring partisan people in senior roles in the government and rewarding their friends. So I think that there's a lot of room for progressive person to come in and really capitalize on that center that's missing. And we'll see who steps forward. Hopefully, we get some diverse candidates. We've still never had a female premier in this province. It's history, which is very surprising in 2025. So, not that it has to be, but I think that there's a lot of room for us to grow with some bold policy. And I think, again, if they focus on what they want to bring to the table and how to engage the members, making sure the members are included on platform development. We had a great AGM, well attended. That's a testament to some of the MPs that we have a good relationship with, because we have all federal seats except one in the province. So capitalizing on that, and maybe there's interest from one of those MPs. I don't know, but I think taking the time was the right decision. I think it helps with trying to find the right candidate or candidates that are going to put their name forward and run.
So you mentioned a couple of things over the course of this conversation. One is that just now you mentioned not really getting past campaigns, which I think is really, really important. As political staffers or politicians, we get really obsessed about losses, and it makes us struggle to see the future. And you also mentioned that, during your own campaign, communications was a struggle. How important do you think it is for the next leader to be a strong communicator? And how important is it for them to not just focus on Tim Houston and all his scandals? Because, this is the struggle we have in Ontario. We always focus on how bad Doug Ford is. But at the end of the day, voters want to hear what you're actually going to do to address those problems and what your plan is going forward. So how important are those two pieces for the next leader?
Yeah, I think it's both. I haven't run an election as the leader in the opposition side, but I think that, you do have to take the job seriously in opposition. Like, that is an important part of our institution, is to find ways to criticize, but there's a way to be constructively partisan, I think. And I think people are tired of the hyper partisanship. I wish more people tuned into the legislature, into question period, to see how the premier and his cabinet answer questions, because it can get to a level of mean-spiritedness that I don't think most Nova Scotians are attracted to. So the next leader, I think, would be well to contrast themselves and show a level of professionalism, to show that they want to hear ideas from Nova Scotians, that they want to consult. That's kind of been something that has been completely taken off considerations for this premier, who likes to put out a manifesto on the front page of the paper and say, people that are against me are special interests, if they just care for the environment, or they just have questions around opening up a debate around fracking or some of these big policy choices. So the Liberals are at their best when I think we're pragmatic and that we really value participatory democracy. And so I think that's really an exciting part about a leadership campaign. We'll see what happens.
So just one last question here, which is, you mentioned how you have two seats, which means in the next election, the Liberals will have a lot of room for prospective candidates to run for you, which could include many young people who want to see change, who are maybe been struggling under the Houston government, could be older people as well. There's going to be a lot of different people who want to see change in the province. What's your advice for them for running for office? Where should they start? What kind of things should they think about? What questions should they ask of themselves before, they take that leap and join you, hopefully, in the government benches next time?
Yeah, and I hope that there is a lot of interest. There certainly is room to grow. I like your optimism there, and we will be attracting candidates from all walks of life and backgrounds, which is really important to inform the policy and stuff we bring forward. And I think we have an opportunity, but it's not going to be automatic. I say this to members. The Liberal Party has been strong for a long time, and we're at the lowest that we have been. So we can't just assume the election cycle will just somehow lift us back up. I also don't think we should be just waiting for a savior to come in as a leader. We need to look within ourselves and run if you have that passion. If you want to fight for your community, step up. There's other ways to support too at the local level, and support somebody else that you think might want to run. And family is a really big part of it as well. You kind of need your family there with you. They need to be part of it and supporting the sacrifice, because it's not always easy. There's a lot of time away from home. There's some you have to take some level of criticism that can get beyond what it should, especially online. So it's not for people that have a thin skin, that's for sure. You have to be realistic, but there's a lot of people out in Nova Scotia doing super important things that and skill sets that we're missing in the legislature. So hopefully we'll see some people step up, and we're going to recruit and talk to lots of people as we have been before. We actually have an official leader. We won't be nominating candidates, but we'll be interested in helping people that are interested.
All right. I think that's a great note to end on. Thanks for joining me today.
I really appreciate your time, and good luck with everything else that you're working on with the podcast.
You've been listening to Progress Canada, presented by Lightbulb Narrative, a Canadian communications company specializing in content creation, narrative development, and strategic communications. Our music was composed by Elliot Middleton. If you enjoyed today's episode, please consider subscribing to access future episodes the moment they drop. Thanks for listening.